All right, let's talk about a phrase you've probably used a million times, rule of thumb. But that dark, kind of messed up origin story you've probably heard about it, yeah, it's a total lie. And we're about to blow the lid right off it. When you say as a rule of thumb, you just mean a quick estimate, right? A handy guideline. But have you heard the story behind it? The one that's super dark, super brutal, and spoiler alert, super wrong? Let's dive into the myth that everyone seems to think is fact.
Okay, so here's the tale. The story goes that this phrase comes from some ancient, horrifying English law. A law that, get this, supposedly said a man was legally allowed to beat his wife as long as the stick he used was no thicker than his own thumb. Seriously.
And this right here, this is supposed to be the smoking gun. It's a famous political cartoon from 1782 making fun of a judge named Francis Buller. You see a guy beating a woman, and he's shouting, "Murder, hey! It's law, you bitch. It's not bigger than my thumb." I mean, wow. It's grim. And for a lot of people, that's case closed. The phrase is canceled, right?
It's a really shocking story. It sticks with you. It makes you angry. And there's just one teeny tiny little problem. What if it's not true at all? What if that whole thing is a complete fabrication?
So, here's the big reveal. In a word, no, it's not true. Not even close. That whole wife-beating law, it never existed, and it has absolutely nothing, zero, to do with the phrase rule of thumb. Okay, so if that's the myth, what's the real story? Well, I'm going to be honest with you, it's a lot more boring. But hey, it's the truth. It's a tale of preachers, fencers, and not a whole lot of drama. So the key here is the timeline. The phrase rule of thumb was already in print way before that Judge Buller cartoon was even a thing. We're talking the mid-1600s with a Scottish preacher. Then in 1692, it pops up in a fencing manual of all places. And in 1721, it's in a book of Proverbs. It was just a normal, everyday phrase. And a real meaning was, well, kind of literal. Think about it. Before we had perfect rulers and tape measures, what did people use? Their bodies. That's why we have a unit of measurement called a foot, or why horses are measured in hands. A rule of thumb was exactly that, using the width of your thumb as a handy, approximate way to measure something. That's it. No horror story, just practicality. So let's just put these side by side for a second. The myth, a horrifying legal justification for wife beating from the 1700s. The reality, a totally boring but useful way to measure cloth in the 1600s. I mean, the difference is huge. It's like comparing a true crime documentary to an episode of a woodworking show. All right, so this is the big question, right? If the story is completely fake, how did it get so popular that practically everyone believes it? Well, it's a fascinating, kind of wild game of historical telephone, and it started a lot more recently than you think. So check out how this happened. We start in 1782 with that cartoon mocking Judge Buller. But here's the crucial detail. The cartoon never actually says rule of thumb. Now, let's fast forward almost 200 years to 1976. A feminist writer named Del Martin is writing about domestic violence and makes a clever but fateful pun. She calls an old, unwritten standard a rule of thumb, so to speak. Then, just a few years later in 1982, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights releases a whole report titled Under the Rule of Thumb. And just like that, boom, the false connection is locked in. So wait, did you catch that? This whole dark, twisted connection to wife beating, it wasn't some long-lost piece of history they dug up. It was basically invented in the 1970s. It's a modern myth wearing a historical costume. This whole thing is just a perfect textbook example of something called folk etymology. That's when a story about a word's origin feels so right, and it's so much more dramatic and interesting that it just completely pushes the boring old truth right out of the way. Okay, so we've gone on this whole journey, debunked the myth. What's the big takeaway? What are we supposed to learn from this wild ride through history, lies, and language?
Well, how about this for a final thought? Maybe a good rule of thumb is to always do your research, because sometimes the craziest, most shocking stories are just that, stories. So the next time you hear some wild origin story for a common phrase, hey, maybe it's worth a quick search. You might be surprised at what you find.